Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Today we continue our discussions in the Gospel of Matthew. This is part 7 of a series, and it's a very special part because it includes some truly probable historical teachings of Jesus, the Beatitudes. So Matthew 5, 1 through 2 states, "When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying." So this is very beautiful. Jesus was kicked out of synagogues. As we see in the Gospel of Mark, his own neighborhood kicked him out. So he left Orthodox gathering places for Judaism, and he went to teach his halakha, often out in nature, in the hills of Judea, throughout Israel, Galilee, Nazareth, the areas that he traveled, and of course in the area of Capernaum, where he went after John was arrested. I just think it's worthy to say that there are no mountains in Israel. It's a desert. There were big hills though, and the idea would be that Jesus would go up a higher elevation so that people could see him. And also amongst larger hills, and it's definitely true in mountains, true mountain ranges, your voice is naturally projected. So many people were coming to Jesus because he was very famous, because number one, John the Baptist kind of gave his stamp of approval on Jesus. He said he recognized Jesus as a great tzaddik, or perfected Jewish saint. He said, "I'm not worthy to untie your sandals, to unlatch your sandals," however they translate it. And many people followed John when they heard that endorsement of Jesus. Many people were interested in listening to his halakha. But what gathered more people to Jesus initially than his teachings were all of his magnificent healings and exorcisms. And we talked about that a little bit last Sunday, or go back to part 6 to hear that. But these healings, these divine healings, and these exorcisms were a demonstration that Jesus shared the Malkuth with God. Malkuth is often translated as kingdom, kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven. But Malkuth means kingship, rulership, sovereignty, as you'll see in some of the Beatitudes today. And Jesus said, some will tell you to look here or look there, but no. The kingdom of heaven is within you, entos, within your heart. So many people began to expect some new Jerusalem to descend after Pauline teachings came about, which was 30 to 50 years after the crucifixion event, long after Jesus had stopped teaching. Paul developed these ideas about Jesus that weren't historical. So people were expecting, after Paul began teaching, Gentile Christians began to expect this second coming of Jesus. And with this second coming, a new kingdom of God, a new Jerusalem would descend. And that was a big distortion of the original teachings of Jesus, because Jesus taught us not to expect a Malkuth, a kingdom, a king domain outside of us. Malkuth can mean kingdom, but Malkuth also means kingship or rulership. And that is apparently what Jesus was referring to when he used the Hebrew Aramaic Malkuth, which is translated all throughout the Christian Testament as kingdom incorrectly. Jesus said very explicitly in the Gospel of Luke, The kingdom of heaven is not here, not there. It is within you. So the Malkuth is God's rulership of your heart. It's really beautiful when we follow and embody the teachings of Jesus, such as are seated in the Beatitudes we'll begin to learn today. You become spiritually reborn. Your heart becomes the throne of the King and Queen of the universe, the Abba, Father, Mother, God. And from that, the Malkuth is also inner guidance. When God establishes his rulership in your heart, he guides you through intuitive motions to do and say things. And this is what Jesus would do on top of a hill. He would teach to many people who had come because they were magnetized to him. They wanted healings, they wanted exorcisms. And some, like in every spiritual crowd around every spiritual master, some really sought God. But Jesus was okay with people coming to him for just healings, because if people could experience the power of God, that proved its existence, and then they might seek the giver of such a healing. But anyhow, there are no mountains in Israel. It's a poor translation. There are very big hills, and Jesus would naturally get on top of a hill so that all of the seekers, all of the disciples, all of the window shoppers could come and see him and hear him, so he could preach his message and encourage them to do spiritual practices. So the Beatitudes were spoken in a very specific way. And we have to remember that the Christian Testament was written by Greek-speaking Romans, Gentile Christians, stemming from the Pauline influence. So these Gentile, Greek-speaking writers or collectors, collators of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, they didn't speak Hebrew and Aramaic, and they often misunderstood Hebrew or Jewish customs. And here, especially in the Beatitudes, we see that the writers of the Gospels did not understand what Jesus was saying, and it made them misinterpret what Jesus was saying. So often, especially in Catholic churches where I grew up, they'll say, pray the Beatitudes, pray them. But the Beatitudes weren't necessarily for praying. Although you can use that material to pray to God for your spiritual growth or for the spiritual growth of humanity, the Beatitudes were prophetic visions of Jesus. They weren't like for example, in Matthew and Luke, the disciples asked Jesus, how should I pray? And he teaches them the Our Abba, who is in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. That's when Jesus taught them to pray. The Beatitudes are not Jesus praying. He went into divine ecstasy on top of a hill with many people listening to him, and he began to have prophetic visions. He saw the future now, at that point in history, and he spoke what he was mystically seeing. Let's describe how we know this. So beatitude means supreme blessedness. When you're in a state of supreme blessedness, you can see God, you can have a vision of God. So praying the Beatitudes is not the correct understanding of the Beatitudes Jesus proclaimed historically. The Beatitudes were originally spoken and understood in what is called the prophetic perfect tense, which is distinct to Hebrew and Aramaic. They have what is coined the prophetic perfect and the prophetic imperfect tenses. The perfect tense means a completed action. Perfect tense means a completed action. Imperfect tense means an incomplete action. So when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven," he didn't say that. He said, "Blessed are the poor, for I see them," visionary, in a vision, inheriting the sovereignty of God. Blessed are the poor, for they are now inheriting the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus said. And it has a much more different meaning, as you'll come to understand as we go through this talk. So, in other words, the Beatitudes are often misconstrued as they're popularly translated, "Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of God." It makes it seem like something is happening at a future time. And many people will interpret it as eschatological prophecies for the end times. When the second coming happens, the poor, suffering people of the world that are, of course, believe in Jesus, according to the Pauline Christology, they will go to heaven with Jesus. A lot of these Beatitudes are interpreted that way, that those that are suffering and faithful will, in the end times, during the second coming, attain this heavenly consciousness, this heavenly realm, be with Jesus. And that's not what it was about. Not at all. So Beatitudes were prophetic proclamations. They were not just mere blessings or material for personal prayer, but prophetic sayings or davarim. A davar is a prophetic utterance from a prophet. So again, they weren't mere blessings, but they were prophetic utterances, davarim, about the advent of the Messianic age, which is reflected in writings attributed to the Essenes and available apocalyptic Haggadah from Jewish tradition. These were prophecies of the coming of the Son of Man collective Messiah. The Son of Man was the Messiah Jesus taught, which he understood based off of studying the book of Daniel, books of Enoch, books of Isaiah, etc. The Beatitudes found in Matthew, according to presiding Bishop Kaiser, who's a biblical scholar, and he's a scholar that understands Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, etc. He is taught in our apostolic tradition that the Beatitudes found in Matthew are more true to the Aramaic core, to the language Jesus spoke, than Luke's version, which is heavily redacted. And we see many other biblical scholars saying the same thing, that Matthew is probably more historical version of Jesus' words than Luke's. But we'll get to Luke's version sometime in the future and compare them then. In the ancient and Hellenistic Galilean Hebrew Aramaic language, there was no past or future tense. That means that Jesus did not say, "Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven." Jesus didn't say that because there was no future tense in the Hebrew Aramaic language. He didn't say it. He didn't say, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will inherit the earth." He didn't say it because there is no future tense. There was only the perfect tense, prophetic perfect tense, and prophetic imperfect tense, which, again, you'll see it on the screen in a moment. Blessed are the poor, for they are inheriting the kingdom of heaven, the sovereignty of heaven, the kingship of heaven. In other words, Jesus is saying that I see my disciples embodying my teachings in thought, word, and deed. And right now, I see their souls attaining the sovereignty of God. God is being reborn in their hearts. They are being reborn as individual messiahs of the Son of Man collective Messiah, the communion of saints. So Greek did have past, present, and future tenses. So the Greek writers of Matthew and also Mark, Luke, John, they used past, present, and future tenses when they quoted Jesus. But we have to understand, the Greek writers did not fully understand the original Hebrew Aramaic ideas, nor the prophetic perfect tense that Jesus spoke in. And therefore they distorted Jesus' actual probable words. This is likely why Gentile Christians misinterpreted Jesus' sayings as eschatological prophecies of the end times, the end of the world, the final judgment, the second coming of Jesus that Paul made up. Paul made it up. Jesus never taught it. Jesus' apostles never taught it. It was a misconstruing of Jesus' words because they didn't understand the Hebrew Aramaic ideas. Again, in Beatitude number 1, Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It makes it sound like this will happen in the future. But it's not. A better understanding is, blessed are the poor, for they are inheriting the messianic sovereignty of heaven, the Malkuth. And it's ridiculous because, Christians twist this first beatitude in such horrible ways. Blessed are the poor. A poor person that has no roof over their head, no food in their stomach, no medicine for the pain in their bodies, does not feel very blessed. They do not feel very blessed. And the Jewish ideas contemporary to the time of Jesus was that if somebody was poor, it was because they had done negative actions. They had negative hub. They were kind of cursed by God to experience poorness or sickness. So, blessed are the poor, as most Christians understand it, because Paul said we should suffer with Jesus. If we carry our crosses, if we suffer with Jesus, then we get the same reward Jesus has in heaven. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. Jesus wanted to help the poor. He fed them. He didn't say, oh, you're blessed. Keep on being hungry. You're sick. There's no medicine for you. You're naked. There's no clothes for you. No. They aren't blessed. But those who are blessed should lift up and empower the poor so that once they are stable, they can lift up other people. So the Jewish understanding, as is the understanding of many other traditions that teach quote-unquote karma, is that you're experiencing poorness because this or in prior lives you didn't do the best possible choices you could have done. And now there's a consequence. But we shouldn't just say, oh, it's the poor's karma to suffer. If it's their karma to be poor, it is our karma to help them. That is the teachings of Jesus and every great master on this planet that has ever been or ever will be. So, This beatitude is distorted. Blessed are the suffering poor, because when Jesus comes again, if they just believe in him, they'll have heaven. That is not what it meant at all. It's not what it meant at all. Let's learn what it did mean. Very, very different. So blessed are the poor, Jesus said, for I see in my prophetic vision right now my disciples are inheriting the messianic sovereignty of heaven, of the Malkuth, because they are embodying, focusing on my teachings in thought, word, and deed. It's happening even now. It's happening during our lifetimes. We're not waiting for some cataclysmic end of the world. Right now, we are spiritually evolving. That's what this beatitude means. The poor. Ebionim, the poor, was a name used by the ascetic first century Jewish Christian Ebionites, who renounced possessions. They gave up all material possessions voluntarily, and held all their resources in common, which is noted by Paul in Acts as an early Jewish Christian practice. So, blessed are the poor, the Ebionim, because these Jewish Christians, that follow my teachings, that embody my teachings, they will inherit the sovereignty of heaven. They are inheriting the sovereignty of heaven even now. Because attaining the Malkuth, attaining illumination, attaining enlightenment, it doesn't happen with the snap of a finger. It happens over time, incrementally. So in the Hebrew words poor, ani, and contrite, anu, they are etymologically related and were used interchangeably with ebionim, the poor, to mean the faithful, the pious, people that are doing the teachings of Jesus. So really, this has nothing to do with poor people, even though we should be helping the poor and the vulnerable in our communities. It has nothing to do with poor people, people that are homeless, people that are without money, people that are without home or resources. The poor is a term used for the early followers of Jesus, such as the Jewish Christian Ebionites. And the Ebionites and the Jewish Christians led by James the Just, the biological brother of Jesus after his crucifixion, the lines of history blur as to whether they were separate groups or the same. They are likely separate, in my opinion, but they shared core ideals, core ideas about the probable historical teachings of Jesus, which are very different from the Pauline Gentile Christian ideas about Jesus, which has become modern church orthodoxy. So if we really want to understand the first beatitude, Jesus would say, blessed are the faithful, the pious ones who are embodying my teachings, for I see them in a divine vision that they are inheriting even now, even right now. They are inheriting the messianic sovereignty of heaven in their hearts. They are becoming spiritually reborn. They are becoming eligible to become merged in the Son of mankind, collective Messiah, the communion of saints, who share in the co-sovereignty of God. Just as I do, I, Jesus, share in the sovereignty of God, and from that power I heal. From that power I exercise. From that power I teach you. So I can lift you up who are poor in spirit, so you can be rich in spirit. So the poor was a name of the Ebionim. And what it really meant were that they were faithful. they were pious. They were poor because they gave up material pursuits for spiritual pursuits. They gave up focus or total focus on material growth, and they prioritized spiritual growth. This term, the poor, was also used by the Essenes. Some people speculate that Jesus was an Essene. I don't think that's true, because when you really examine the probable historical teachings of Jesus, they had a much different expectation than the Essenes. The Essenes seem to have a pessimistic view, just like John the Baptist. John the Baptist was likely an Essene. And they did predict the cataclysmic end of the world. That you better return to the way of God because the world's ending. Jesus had an optimistic viewpoint of the end of the world, as we see in the writings of Papias, which describe this spiritual evolution of the earth and humanity. It didn't describe an end. It described a beginning, and from that new beginning, a growth. But anyhow, this term, the poor, meaning faithful and pious, was also used by the Essenes to describe themselves, as it was also a term used by Ebionites to self-identify or describe themselves. And this idea of giving up everything in voluntary poverty, which the Ebionim and the Essenes both did, is understood by the Hebrew term kihesh, which means non-attachment or prioritizing spiritual attainment over material attainment. So, that's enough for today. We'll do the rest of the Beatitudes next Sunday in part 2. Let's continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.